Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. Today we've got James Krieger back on the show. James came on for a chat on episode number 32, and we spoke all about non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT for short. And today we're exploring the world of body fat measurement. It's great to have you back on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we get into the methods in which we can measure body fat, or more accurately, as you put it, predict body fat levels, can you expand on your analogy around predicting the weather and body fat percentages? Because I think it's spot on.
Yeah. So a lot of people think, when they say, "Oh, I had my body fat tested," that they measured your body fat, and they actually didn't. In fact, none of the techniques actually measure your body fat. And I compare it to predicting the weather. Like the weatherman doesn't, when he does a forecast, he's not measuring the weather per se. He's predicting what he thinks the weather is going to be like based on models and, computer models and all this stuff. And that's actually what body fat testing is. It's actually a prediction. You're trying to predict what your body fat is based on measuring something else. So you're measuring something that tends to be related to body fat. But just like the weatherman can't perfectly predict the weather, body fat testing can't perfectly predict your body fat levels. And in fact, the error can be quite high, probably a lot higher than what a lot of people don't realize. Just how big the error can be. So people put too much faith in the numbers that they get from body fat testing, and they need to understand that it's a very, very rough approximation.
Right, which we're going to delve into here. So can you tell us a bit about the 2 and 4 compartment models that are estimating body fat, and that those sort of models are based on, and then we can get into the specifics around underwater weighing and things like that?
Yeah. So the gold standard, or most body fat testing methods, are what we'd call a 2-compartment model, which means it just separates your body into 2 components. That'd be fat mass and fat-free mass. And fat-free mass is everything that's not fat, and that includes body water, muscle, bone, internal organs, all that stuff. And most body fat testing methods are based on that type of model. The gold standard for assessing body composition is actually called a 4-compartment model, and that actually divides the body into fat mass, mineral, which is like bone, protein, and water. But the only way to get a 4-compartment model done is through, it can only be done in research. It's very expensive to do, requires a lot of different measurements and things like that. So most people don't have access to a 4-compartment model. So really then what you do is, you have a 2-compartment model, and a lot of 2-compartment models are they try to validate them against the 4-compartment model. So that's kind of how that works.
Right. And then getting into the underwater weighing, which uses a 2-compartment model, can you sort of break down the process of that, and then some of the accuracy around underwater weighing if someone was to go ahead and test their body fat that way?
Yeah. So I guess first I want to say that really this applies to all the body fat testing methods. All of them are fine if you're looking at a group data. So if I'm taking a group of people and I look at the average body fat for that group, it's going to do a reasonably good job compared to a 4-compartment model. And it really doesn't matter whether I use BIA or hydrostatic weighing or whatever. Where you start to get a problem is when you start trying to do it on an individual level, which is how most people tend to do it. And the error rates tend to get much, much higher on an individual level. And so, with hydrostatic weighing, basically what you're doing is you're trying to look what's called body density. So, and that's done by basically dunking you in a tank and looking at your, how much water you displace. That's your body volume. And then comparing that to your body weight to get your body density. So like body fat is less dense than lean mass, and so based on the measurements, we can get a prediction or an estimate of your body fat when we do hydrostatic weighing. So that's kind of how it works.
And there's all sorts of funky stuff that can kind of throw off that test, right? I mean, anywhere from bubbles on your hair and like all sorts of funky stuff that can just skew the result.
Yeah. If you don't get if you don't, you have a residual air in your lungs, you try to breathe out as much as you can, but you can never breathe out all the air in your lungs, so there's always some residual air there that you have to that's usually estimated, and if you don't blow out as much air as you can, then obviously you got more air in your lungs than should be there. Bubbles and stuff can affect the test, and even things that have nothing to, even the test is based on assumptions like that fat-free mass has a certain density, but your ethnicity can actually impact that. So different ethnicities have different different densities of fat-free mass, and so even your ethnicity can actually impact the accuracy of the assessment. So there's a lot of things that can impact it, and then even like as your body weight changes over time, as you lose weight or gain weight, the density of fat-free mass can change, which then throws off the assumptions of the test. So that can cause problems if you're trying to track over time. Because a lot of people will, I've had people tell me like, oh, well, yeah, sure, there's a lot of error in these tests, but hey, as long as I'm using the same test over time, it should be fine, right? And I'm like, well, no, because the assumptions these tests are based on, those assumptions change as you lose or gain weight. And that can affect the accuracy of the test. So people just need to be aware of just how inaccurate the testing can be.
Yeah. And building off that point, it's almost like, the further down the line you go with some of this stuff, the errors are actually compounding as opposed to just, adding up. And so you can come out with some super skewed digits. And then on the ethnicity front, I don't know how somebody would account for this, but for example, I am half Indian, half Caucasian. And so I don't know how you would even figure the equations for somebody that's a mixed ethnicity.
I don't know either.
Okay, fair enough. So moving on to Bod Pod, that falls under the 2-compartment model along with underwater weighing. So you'd think that they would be reasonably similar when it comes to accuracy, but that's not necessarily the case. So first of all, what is the Bod Pod and how does it stack up to underwater weighing, for example?
Yeah, the Bod Pod is based on the same principle, but what they use air displacement rather than water displacement. So, but the problem with the Bod Pod is that there's things that can affect its accuracy. Again, like facial hair and stuff like that. What you're wearing when you're in the Bod Pod, like the type of shorts or swimsuit or whatever that you're wearing in there can affect it. Anything, body heat, things that can affect the air pressure in the Bod Pod itself. And so what's interesting is even though they're based on similar principles, the data seems to indicate that the Bod Pod tends to fare worse on an individual level compared to hydrostatic weighing. It does fine. Again, for group data, it's fine, but on individual level, the error rates tend to be even higher for Bod Pod compared to hydrostatic weighing.
Okay, gotcha. That totally makes sense. And then the Bioelectrical Impedance, or BIA, for folks who don't know, this is like the most convenient method, I'd say, aside from maybe Skinfolds. But with most things, the convenience comes with a cost. So how does BIA estimate our body fat? And then what does the research say about its accuracy?
Really what BIA is doing is just estimating your body water is really what it's doing. So it's based on the concept that fat-free mass has more water, so it will have less resistance to an electrical current compared to fat mass. And so, we run a very light electrical current through you, and we measure the resistance to that current, and then plug it into some equations to get an estimate of your body fat that way. And again, it's basically just trying to estimate body density, just like a lot of the other two-compartment model techniques. BIA is probably one of the worst methods. Again, on a group, for group data, it's fine, but for individual data, again, probably one of the worst. It's probably one of the worst methods out there. The error rates are just massive. I mean, in my personal experience with BIA, I mean, I used to work with a lot of obese clients and in a weight management program, and they did BIA on the clients, and we would have clients that just lost massive amounts of weight, and yet the BIA would show their body fat percentage going up, and it was just obvious that it hadn't. But it was really problematic. So I'm, out of all the techniques, usually BIA is the one I say to have people avoid on an individual level, at least. Yeah. And there's just a lot of stuff. Even eating a meal can actually impact your BIA measurements, believe it or not. So,
or drinking some fluid, drinking some water, right? I mean, I've stepped on a BIA scale or machine and hopped off and then maybe hopped on 5 minutes later, and I actually didn't do anything. And the result was drastically different.
Yeah.
So moving on to the Skinfold. So most folks are familiar with Skinfold testing, where someone takes a caliper, pinches the skin and fat underneath the skin on a bunch of different parts of your body. But how do the Skinfold measurements work, and how do they hold up to the other means of body fat estimation?
Skinfolds, basically what you're doing is you're taking pinches, you're trying to pinch the fat, that's over the muscle and stuff in various sites on the body, and you add up the skin folds, and you basically just plug it into an equation to get an estimate of body density that way. Again, on an individual level, the error rates can be pretty high. One area that skin folds do well, though, is for tracking change over time. And really, that makes sense because you're pinching the body fat, basically. I mean, if you're losing fat over time, those skin folds are going to get smaller. So for people that use skin folds to track change over time, usually my recommendation is don't even worry about the body fat percentage that you get. Just check the actual millimeter measurements and just track those, So skin folds, I think, can work on an individual level for tracking change over time. I think actually out of a lot of the techniques, they're one of the better ones for tracking change. But the actual the body fat percentage that you get, like the actual number, can be way off. So I always tell people, don't pay attention to that number. Just look at, hey, are your skin folds going down over time? If they are, then obviously you're losing fat.
Okay, yeah, that's super useful. Now, some folks use a different amount of sites. So maybe 3 Skinfold sites, and others use up to 7. So does the research say anything about the more sites we use being more accurate, or does that simply just compound the error rate and make things harder to assess? How does the research parse that out?
To be fair, I haven't read enough papers in the area to know, whether, like a 7 site does better than a 3 site. My guess is it's probably, more sites might be a little bit better, but you're still going to have a massive error rate. So, I mean, if your individual error rate is something like plus or minus 10 percentage points, maybe it'll improve to plus or minus 8, but that's still a huge error rate,
Right.
So I don't know if the number of sites really improves accuracy enough to make it, to really make it worthwhile.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess it could go either way. And one thing that I've noticed that you've recommended is to get the same person to do your skin folds, just so if they are off, then they're consistently off, or if they are accurate, they're consistently accurate.
Yeah. Because if you get different people, then they may have slightly different techniques, and that's going to affect your measurements. So.
Right. And lastly, we've got Dexa, which actually doesn't use a 2 or 4 compartment model, but a 3 compartment model. So can you explain that, how Dexa works, and then how accurate or inaccurate this assessment tool is? Yeah.
So Dexa basically separates the bone component out of the fat-free mass. So it'll be fat mass, non-mineral, basically non-bone fat-free mass, and then bone mineral fat-free mass. So that's a 3 compartment model. Again, Dexa on an individual level, some people think it's the gold standard. It's not. Its error rates on an individual level actually can be fairly high in some cases, and it's affected by a lot of the same assumptions. Like even Dexa assumes that your fat-free mass has a certain density and stuff like that. I could eat a meal before a Dexa scan and actually impact my measurement that way. So it's not, people need to understand that Dexa can have a fairly high individual error rate too. I mean, it's definitely one of the better methods on an individual level compared to some of the others. It can still be problematic. So, I mean, I've seen some male physique competitors who obviously lost body fat, and yet their Dexa scan showed no change, and it was clearly not the case. So, it's something people need to be aware of.
Yeah, I'm not sure how Dexa sort of became the industry standard, or I don't know how that came to be exactly, but I have heard of folks like getting a Dexa scan, and then going back again, pounding a whole bunch of carbohydrate and getting some drastically different numbers in a short period of time where, there wasn't a huge change in body comp.
Yeah.
Now that we covered the different methods, what does this mean for the average individual in practical implication terms? Meaning, how do you recommend or not recommend folks look at this body fat estimation stuff, James?
So for me, for most people, I say you don't even need body fat testing. For most people, it's just if you just use a combination of circumference measurements like waist circumference and your body weight and how your clothes fit and stuff like that. For the general population, that's all you need. You don't need to do a body fat test. Now, if you do decide to do a body fat test, you should take very long periods of time between measurements. Like, don't be testing it every couple weeks or something like that, because the error rate of the test is larger than the change you'll see in that time. I say minimum of 3 months, and better yet, maybe 6 months or longer. So if you are going to do use those techniques, then that's what I would recommend. The only times I really actually even recommend a body fat assessment is to physique competitors and bodybuilders and stuff like that who are looking to do a contest prep, and they need to have at least a rough estimate of their fat-free mass so they can decide, how many weeks out they need to start and, things like that. In those cases, I think it can be useful then, but otherwise, for most people, it's not really that useful. Like I said, just use a combination of other metrics that are really easy to do. Waist circumference is a big one. I mean, if your waist size is going down, you're losing body fat. If your clothes are fitting better, you're losing body fat. So, like I said, circumference measurements and body weight, and like I said, clothing fit, things like that. I think those are the best ways, really, for someone to assess body fat over time.
Yeah. Now, personally, with my clients, I use photos and their scale weight predominantly. And then if they want to use physical measurements like waist circumference, etc., I'm all for it. But I find I get the best bang for my buck with pics and then the good old scale. So how are you assessing your clients' progress?
Actually, I use pictures as well. Basically, I use a combination of body weight, circumference measurements, and pictures, basically, is what I use. Those are my primary three.
Gotcha. Now, having said all that, it's kind of fun or it may be fun or interesting for someone to know a rough estimate of their body fat percentage. However, you sort of look how you look. And I think it's important for people to take that digit with a grain of salt, considering the inaccuracy of the measurement tools, but also simply saying that you're like X percent body fat doesn't really mean anything. So I think what James is saying, like how you look, feel, perform, is going to be the most important. How your clothes are fitting. Like if you go for a test and you check 3 or 6 months later, like you're going to know if you've made changes or not. You're probably not going to need the body fat measurement to let you know if you're progressing. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. Now, can you remind folks where they can find stuff like your research review as well as your social media handles, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so if you just go to weightology.net, that's weightology.net. My research review is on there. I've got a bunch of free articles, including an article series on body fat testing that people can check out. And also all my past podcast appearances, including I'll eventually put this one on there. And then, and I also do online coaching as well. So yeah, that's where people can find me. And all my social media accounts are on there as well.
Awesome, man. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. And yeah, I'll link to the body fat assessment article series as well, because it's amazing. And if somebody wants to dig in a little more detail and know all the research and the science behind it, then they can find that stuff there. But I really appreciate you coming back on the show and taking the time, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. I'll catch you guys on the next episode.